Well guys, it is 8:23 PM and we're just in the final stages of wrapping up this 6-speed swap. So in this episode we're going to be covering basically the front brake install, rear brake install, how to bleed both front and rear, and also the clutch slave install and how to bleed that, along with a few other miscellaneous things that we'll show along the way. Also be sure to check out the previous episode, which is part 3, where we covered the rear diff, the shafts, the hubs, and also the handbrake assembly. So starting at the back here, Brett's going to replace his current single piston rear calipers with these 2-piston ones from the STI donor vehicle. To install these, there's really nothing much to them. You know, you got your 2 bolts that bolt it to the hub, and then basically all that's left to do is just push the pistons back, make sure they're retracted, and then you've just got to insert your brake pads, followed by one of the slider pins, and then you can go ahead and insert your brake pad anti-rattle bracket, and then you can insert the final slider pin to hold that in place, as you can see here. And then once you've done that, all that's left to do is just to put this wire in between the 2 pins, as you can see Brett doing here, which basically just stops them rattling out, and then your brake pads fall out, and God knows what other bad shit would happen with that. So ladies and gentlemen, this is what can happen if you install brake pads at say 10 o'clock at night and in the dark.
Brett did, dude. What did I do?
So guys, when it comes to bleeding brakes, everyone's got their preferred methods, and you know, I'm the same. I do different methods for different vehicles, but I'll give you the rundown of what we did on this vehicle in particular. So the first thing we'll touch on is the brake bleeding sequence. Now there's a few different ways you can do this. You got the traditional method, which is basically you bleed the brake further from the master cylinder first, and then you work your way closer to the master cylinder. But there is also another way that Subaru actually recommend to bleed their brake systems. So this is basically because of the ABS system. So they recommend to actually do the passenger front, then the driver's rear, then the driver's front, and then the passenger rear. So the way we did these brakes, we actually used the traditional method. And as you can see in Adrian's hand, the first step that he uses is the vacuum brake bleeder. This is a hand operated one, so the principle behind this is basically you connect it to the bleed nipple, you pump it up and make some vacuum, and then you crack the bleed nipple. This is a good way to pull good fluid through the calipers and quite quickly. Then there's also the fact that you can do this by yourself as well. So after going around the car with the handheld vacuum pump, the next and final method is to bleed the brakes with the traditional 2-man method, which I'll explain to you now. So simply put, this method obviously has 2 people. So you got one person in the car operating the brake pedal, and the other person at the brake caliper you're bleeding operating the bleed screw. So step 1, the person at the caliper will signal the person at the brake pedal to push down. So while the brake is slowly being depressed, the person at the caliper will crack the bleed nipple and then close it back off before the pedal is released. Then with the bleed nipple closed, the person at the wheel will signal up, and then the process repeats itself. So basically the idea of this is you want to keep doing this until you get new fluid through and you do not see any more air bubbles. And be sure to keep checking your brake fluid and topping it up as you go, because if you get this too low, you will then suck air back into the system and then you'll kind of be back to square one. So as we near the end of this series, the last thing to do once your brakes are all bled is just to set up your handbrake. So this is quite easy. There's a little inspection hole that's covered up by a little rubber bung in the back of the handbrake dust cover, as you can see. So the way this works is basically there's a star-shaped nut inside this opening which moves the brake shoes in or out to get more friction on the inside of the rotor. So what Adrian's method for this is, and it's a very good one, is basically you tighten it up until you can no longer rotate the hub or the brake assembly by hand, and then you back it off 4 rotations. Well guys, that just about wraps up everything there is to the 6-speed driveline swap. So all that's left now is to chuck everything back on the car and take it for a test drive.
So how's that light in your eyes?
Fucking awesome.
So anyway,
Hey?
what are we doing under here?
How's the clutch friction point?
It's pretty good. There's like this much trouble.
That's what you want.
Yeah.
Those quick shifts. So it's 26 minutes past midnight and we're on our way home.